You said that the 5,000 odd children are under the care of the state. Do you think we've seen the state take in and step into areas where it typically used to be the church or charities would look after people in need? Do you think we have become too reliant on the state and the state has taken on too much responsibility instead of letting churches and charities protect the children instead? Is that how you would prefer to see it?
Yes, it's certainly a very important Liberal Party philosophy that we want the government to be as small as possible and to be involved when it's absolutely necessary. So it's absolutely necessary for there to be a judiciary. It's absolutely necessary for there to be a police force. It's absolutely necessary for there to be a health department, an education department. All of these things are absolutely necessary to be running a good quality modern democracy as we have the blessing and the opportunity to live in. But it's not absolutely necessary for the government then to get involved in every single thing. Let's take education as one example. At the moment, the Cook Labor government have said if they're re-elected at this election, they intend to make changes to the Equal Opportunity Law. Why is that relevant to education? Well, faith-based schools rely heavily on exemptions in that particular piece of legislation to allow them to determine who will stand at the front of every classroom or in an administration office or in a school, making sure that they are people and individuals who live out values and a framework consistent with the parents. Not surprising that parents would want to be sending their child, if they decide to send them to a faith-based school, that they would want the person standing in their place, teaching and educating their child, to be someone who shares their values in every way possible. The government wants to remove that exemption. Now, that's a classic example where the government does not need to stick its big nose into the business of parents who are primarily responsible for the education of their kids. But it all ultimately depends on your political philosophy. If you're like me and the Liberal Party, you believe that parents have the primary responsibility for the education of their children and the state has a role to facilitate that. And if that could mean state-based education, if that's the choice of the parents. So you should provide some form of service, but you shouldn't then be dictating to the parents. Whereas the left, they hold a different view. They want to try and control everything. They want to say, look, this is the only way in which children should be educated. Well, we fundamentally disagree with that. And so consequently, you see policy difference like this at the election. If the Cook Labor government are re-elected, well, they've made it clear faith-based schools are going to have a headache. If the Liberal Party's elected, we're saying there'll be no changes to that exemption.
Does your philosophy on parents making the decisions on things like education for their children, does that translate to decisions like health? So we have happening around the world at the moment, the gender changes that the debates raging all the time. Do you think that the state should have a role in protecting children from undergoing any sort of gender changes, or do you think it should be up to the parents and a medical professional?
Yeah, it's a super controversial topic. It's very, very pertinent at the moment, and not just in Western Australia, but as you say, around the globe. And again, there's two schools of thought on this, and myself, and I think I can speak quite appropriately on behalf of the Liberal Party in Western Australia, where Libby Medham, our leader, has made some strong commitments in this respect. We hold a very different view to the left in this respect. And ultimately what we say is that, first and foremost, everyone loves to talk about follow the science. Well, wouldn't it be a good idea if we did that when it came to gender, so-called gender theory? The international evidence is becoming overwhelming by the day that if you start to introduce things like puberty blockers for young children, it's going to have a consequence. Well, it baffles me that anyone would be surprised about that. long-term effects. And so that's why Libby Medham has said, look, if we get elected, we're banning the use of puberty blockers. It's just not going to continue. We can't continue to allow this to happen in our states on our watch when we know that the evidence is saying what it is. And yet, if we say anything like that, and probably I'll be vilified for having just said exactly what I have just said, if you do anything like that, that's all that you get in return is you get vilification, you get all of the rhetoric, but no one actually sits down with you and says, well, actually, no, this is a really good, safe, appropriate course of action for children to be taking. But that's just, if you like, on the research and the science and the international evidence. But then if we take a further step back, it's pretty incredible to think that we would be facilitating children making these kind of life-changing decisions at that particular age.
But adults, so you think it should be...
It's always
18?
more complicated when it comes to adults, right? Because at the end of the day, adults should be free, wherever possible, within the bounds of the law, to be making decisions for themselves, unless... And there are exceptions to that when a person has some form of incapacity to be able to make their own decisions. That's why in Western Australia we have, laws with regard to enduring powers of guardianship, enduring powers of attorney, things like that. When somebody loses a capacity, there's going to be a substitute decision maker. But that needs to be dealt with, again, very, very carefully, because you can quickly see how that gets abused. That's why we have the scourge of elder abuse. Not just, again, in Western Australia or in Australia, but around the world, where people take advantage of somebody who has an incapacity. But generally speaking, as a matter of principle, of course, adults should have the liberty and the freedom to be able to do things within the bounds of the law. Now, it's one thing for somebody to have the liberty to do something, but it's another thing for the government of the day or the parliament of the day to, in a sense, give them a licence to do so. And this is a very important philosophy that is constantly not understood in our parliaments, the difference between liberty and licence. And that freedom for people to be able to take certain actions is very different to a government saying, here you go ahead, we're going to give you a licence to do that. And when it comes to gender, I think that's exactly the point. If a person wants to take certain actions in respect to their body or their state of dress or their appearance, well, ultimately they've got the liberty to be able to do that. But should they have a licence from government to essentially give them the pat on the back and be encouraging that? Well, I say no.
So in WA, just for those who are watching from around the world, you can legally change your gender identity on your birth certificate without having gone underneath any transitioning. You can just suddenly wake up and say, today I identify as a man, and you can go in and change that on your birth certificate without having to prove anything. That's the current state of play.
It has changed. So historically, that wasn't the case. You could get a gender recognition certificate, right? So you could undertake a procedure, right? It doesn't require too much imagination to recognise what those kind of procedures might be. And then you might be able to then apply to what was known as the Gender Reassignment Board, and you could then get a certificate recognising your so-called new gender. Okay, so that used to be the process. The Cook Labor government have blasted a bill through the parliament to change that, so that now any Western Australian of any age, mind you, so including children, are now legally eligible to change the sex on their birth certificate. So again, there'll be strong views about what should this all look like and so on and so forth. But there's a big difference between somebody having to undertake a procedure and then getting a certificate recognising their new gender, right? Their birth certificate still stays the same, but they've got this certificate, right? That's a very different system to what the Cook Labor government are saying. Oh no, we'll come in with the eraser and change the sex of the person on their birth certificate. Well, our leader, Libby Medham, has called this madness, and I totally agree with her. A birth certificate is a statement of fact. You and I have both got birth certificates. Everybody who's watching this has got a birth certificate, and on the birth certificate, it records certain facts. The date that a person was born, the place where the person was born, and one of the facts that's recorded on there is the sex that was observed at birth and recorded on the paperwork and ultimately on the birth certificate. Now, that's something that shouldn't change. And there's a different conversation to be had about, people who want to then identify as purportedly as a person of the opposite gender. I think that's a different conversation to, in effect, falsifying a birth certificate.